where our highest leaders are held to the highest standards. They're held to the same account that any other person would be. And we have authority. So it's a slow process to remove somebody from office, but it can be done through voting. Oh, cool. Okay, so you're limited government from the very start, right? They put by their class also have a hard time between farmers and framers. Why are they called the framers? Because they put a structure in place. They built something literally from the ground up that has defined boundaries to it. And that's a limited government is a defined government. And they start with limiting the most powerful part, the part that they were the most afraid of, and that's the federal government. Okay, what are your options, right? If you don't like something that a state legislates, if there's something that comes down that you just cannot live with, you got every right in the United States to leave, pack up and go to a different state. If you just simply can't live with what they've decided to do, you have that freedom to move internally. Some countries, you don't. Because there is that. On the other hand, the limits on federal power are, we talked, I think, maybe just about gun laws. There are going to be state laws about guns. That's where most of those laws come from. However, there are federal laws that apply to guns in every single state. Certain weapons are banned, and certain that's so we're subject to both laws. Limited government does come into federalism because limits on federal power over states define you guys, we do this kind of weird stuff all the time. Utah actually fought it for a while, but there was a referendum put to the people that they voted for revenue sharing with the federal government. And it would be something like this. It was an expansion to medical treatment or medical insurance that basically Utah had to put about 10% into it, and the federal government would pay the other 90%. And Utah didn't want to agree to it. They didn't want to do it. So the people ran petitions, gathered signatures, got it done, and lo and behold, passed. Well, this last week, the window closed for people to sign up for that insurance. And there's like 50,000 people more signed up than last year, so it is fairly popular. But that's an example of where the federal government's taking a huge amount of money, and the states have to put a small amount of money, and they're sharing in that power. That's federalism. That's federalism working right. And look at UTA, they're helping us clear our air by helping pay our bus expenses. Keeps your fare down enough that you can ride it. Watch, this month they're going to have some free weeks. Might even be, I don't think it's going to be the whole month, but that's actually one of the laws being looked at. Okay, separation of powers we talked about, that is to the branches. Separation of powers defines the three branches. And in so doing, enables the system of checks and balances. Different branches of government have ways to check the power of the other branches. Okay, he's going to talk about this in a second. We'll come back to this frame. Let's go to this one. That's a tiny graph, but okay, those are the ways that those different branches check each other. There's not a lot of checks on the Supreme Court, on the judicial branch. At least in the upper federal positions, when you are a justice, you are appointed for life. And unless you violate the oath of office, then you won't be removed until you retire or die. So, but what's the check on the judicial branch? The appointment process. When the president, the executive branch, appoints justices, they have to meet what's called the advice and consent of the Senate. So the Senate has to hold hearings and approve of them, which they generally do, although it's a contentious process. So the check on the judicial branch is whether or not your appointment goes through. What does the judicial branch check on the legislative branch? In return, they will rule certain pieces of legislation to be unconstitutional. It's the same check that they have on the executive branch. Okay? The executive branch appoints these justices. That's their check on judicial power. And the Justice Department, the judicial branch, can determine acts of the president, executive orders, to be unconstitutional. And they do so on a fairly regular basis. Okay? And then between those two, Congress can approve presidential nominations, they can control the budget, they can pass laws, and they can do so over the president's veto. The veto, or the threat of the veto, is the president's check on Congress's power. I will say this, I don't think presidents use the veto quite as often as they should or could, or even threaten it, because, and here's why, that's a pretty good power. 51% or in some cases more to pass laws, but the president can veto anything that they want, and it's pretty rare that the Congress has 2/3 of both houses of Congress going to support something. That is pretty rare. It is far more common for them to do 51% pass something. So that's a check that they maybe don't use very often, and they probably could and should. Okay, judicial review, that is what we just talked about. That is the Supreme Court declaring the constitutionality of law. It starts with a case called Marbury versus Madison. You will need to know that for a subsequent test. Okay, after Marbury versus Madison, the Supreme Court is considered to have that authority. And then last on there, federalism, the purposely designed tension in power between the states and the federal government. Okay, you tend to run into these kind of things where, here's a great example. The federal government comes in, the EPA, and decides that, say they declare a species to be going extinct, and they will put laws in place that say you can't develop this, you can't build this dam, you can't do this, they block everything. And you can't do it because it endangers this one small species of turtle or something. And local people can get very upset about that. They do, and challenge it. But that is a contentious or a friction relationship between the federal government and local governments. Utah goes through it all the time. And that's because there's an awful large percentage of federally held land, controlled land, in Utah. And there are restrictions on how it can be developed. Mining, oil, export, all kinds of things that people would like to do there. And the federal government blocks them for any number of reasons. But if they are in control of land, that's a friction relationship between those two. So we're going to zip forward to a couple of things I don't think we need too much of the history right now. We can look at that after. Federalism looks like this. There's national, state, and local governments. Supremacy Clause states that federal laws Override state laws. And that's your marble cake. On the left, you have what the traditional cake looks like. That's what we used to think of federalism. Federal government's at the top, controlling from the top down, and there's not a communication between those or sharing of power. Really, what's more likely, what more often happens, is the one on the right, where it's mixed together. There's cooperation between federal and state governments. That being said, they all have their kind of sacred things that they are able to do. And that's indicated in the pink area right there between those two. Okay, on the left-hand side, you have things that only the federal government can do. Coin money, tax imports, all right, maintain the armed forces, declare war, amend the Constitution. Over on the right side, states get to regulate commerce intrastate. They are responsible for their schools, issuing licenses, permits, certificates. But in the middle of the pink, they both do taxes, they both borrow money, they have their court system, and they make and enforce laws. So those things in the middle are called concurrent powers because both federal and state do them at the same time. Including that nasty one down there on the bottom. Take private land for public use with just compensation. That's called eminent domain. Can the government come in and say, look, your house that you won't sell to the developer is in the way of this new shopping mall. It's going to be great for the community. You got to sell it to we're going to take it. We're going to use eminent domain. Take your house because you're in the way of business. And that's bad for the community. Nope, they can't do that. They could come in and say, your house is directly in the way of a road that needs to go through for fire protection to this wilderness area. And we are going to take your house. We'll give you just compensation what the market value is for the house and property. But we have the authority to take that piece of property if it's for the good of the community, not for business. It has to be for something like that. So, okay, we're done with that for now. We'll get back to that next week. I've got a really short thing. You can take notes on this too. You'll love this guy. It's very clear. Mr. Raymond's going to talk to you about, we'll fast forward at certain appropriate places. He's going to talk about a similar list, but eventually take it across all the things that you need for the quiz we'll make in the last 5 minutes.
Hi, and welcome back to Mr. Raymond's Civics EOC Academy, where last time we broke down the articles of the Constitution. We kind of looked at the whole document. But in this lesson, we are going to look at what are called the principles of the Constitution. Now, principles are like the major themes. Okay, we see a definition for a principle here. It's a fundamental truth, concept, or a foundation. And foundations are a good way to think of these. Remember, foundations are things that you build on top of. And these principles are not only principles for the Constitution, but kind of what the whole government and our country are built upon. Now, if you Google principles of the Constitution, you're likely to get a few slightly different lists, but most of them have similar principles. Now, I'm going to give you mine in a minute, but before we do, let's take a look at one of the many benchmarks that these principles can be found in. And I say many because these are themes that will be used throughout this course. And each one of these principles is very likely to be an answer on your state exam. So one of the benchmarks that has two of our principles in it says to describe how the Constitution limits the powers of government through separation of powers and checks and balances. And so we see separation of powers and checks and balances, which are two of our 6 principles.
No, he's got 3. The limit on the powers, that's the limits of government. So, see what I'm saying? When they all work together, they kind of work together. It's alright, you'll still get them on the quiz if you get here.
But before we look at the rest of the list, just a reminder, teacher, that this PowerPoint, as well as a variety of lessons, are available. The principles. So make sure you write these down. Again, I recommend 2-column notes. Put the principle in the left and your description in the right. Okay, so first off, we've worked with 3 of these. And the first one is popular sovereignty, separation of powers, checks and balances, limited government, and federalism. Oh, and by the way, I guess I have 5. I think I said 6 before. Okay, but that is the list of the principles that we're going to work with. And again, it's 5. Okay. So I'm going to start with limited government, because this is the principle that all of the other ones fall under. Limited government goes back to the theme we've been talking about, which was the fear of the government having too much power. And by the way, this is something that we still debate today. We talked about our first constitution called the Articles of Confederation, which was made weak on purpose. And I hope you're noticing a pattern here. Again, controlling power was the chief concern of the framers to the Constitutional Convention. Why? Remember, they lived under a king, and the idea that power was something that was abused was just ingrained in not just the framers, but throughout the Enlightenment worlds, down to the people. Okay, this idea that power can corrupt people. Okay, so the concept of, or principle of limited government demonstrates what was really a central theme of these principles. Giving one person or a small group of people too much power is dangerous. Now, in this case, the fear was not so much the state governments. After all, these were made up of locals, and these people all knew each other. This was a fear of the national government. So the theme of limited government goes with the idea that, yes, this new constitution was giving the national government a lot of new powers, but they could only do what was listed in the Constitution. And this is an idea we're going to come back to, not just in this video, but in a lot of upcoming videos. Now, popular sovereignty we discussed in a previous video when we learned about the preamble to the Constitution and those famous first 3 words, we the people. We talked about how popular means people and sovereignty means power. So popular sovereignty means that the people have the power in the U.S. federal government and the state government. Now, how do the people exercise this power? Well, they vote. We vote for leaders who are going to do what we want, or else we will vote for someone else. So think of popular sovereignty as people power. Our motto being, we the people. The next principle of the Constitution is separation of powers. And we learned about this when we discussed the French Enlightenment philosopher Montesquieu. Montesquieu suggested breaking down the powers that had previously been held by kings for the most part. And those powers are to make laws, enforce laws, and judge laws. And this was a huge change when we created the 3 branches. Okay, we have the U.S. legislative branch, which we call Congress, and they have the power to make laws. We have the executive branch headed by a president to enforce laws, and a judicial branch with the Supreme Court to judge or interpret the laws. Now this seems obvious to us today because we've had this government for over 225 years. Okay, so this is a concept that has survived the test of time, but back in 1789, this relatively new idea. So our next principle is checks and balances. This goes hand in hand with separation of powers. It really just takes it to a next level by giving the 3 branches the power to keep the other 2 branches in check. If one branch is doing something that is quote-unquote bad, the other branches have the ability to stop them. So let's look at an example of checks and balances. And these are probably the most important checks and ones that you really need to memorize for your state exam. And they have to do with the power of making laws. After all, making laws is the major job of government, and it provides the most opportunity for officials to abuse their power. So, as hopefully you've caught on at this point, the job of the legislature, aka Congress, is to make laws. Now, in an upcoming video, we're going to really look at the lawmaking process in more detail. But for this lesson, you just need to know that a law as made by Congress is not actually a law at first. It's called a bill. So when Congress creates a bill, it is sent over to the president for his approval. He can either sign the bill, making it a law, or he can veto it, which means he disapproves of it. So if he vetoes it, that is his check. Okay, now usually this is the end of it, and Congress would have to try to make a new law. However, they can override his veto if 2/3 of both houses vote in favor of the bill. It becomes a law. However, this is very difficult and rare, but this is something we'll look at later this year. Now, what can the judicial branch do? Well, they can declare a law unconstitutional. If they declare a law unconstitutional, they strike it down. Okay, they get rid of the law, and this is their check on the legislative branch. And by the way, this is a way that they've gotten rid of some horrible laws like segregation in school, and we're going to look more at that when we learn about the Supreme Court in a lot greater detail. Okay, so our final principle is federalism. And federalism is the concept in which power is shared between the national government and the state governments. And this goes back to what we discussed at the beginning of the video. Remember that when the Articles of Confederation was written, a lot of state governments were reluctant to give the federal government too much power. Well, as you know, the states needed to compromise and give the national government the power to collect taxes, and enforce their laws, and it even created 2 new branches. However, this was not a full license to give them all of the powers that the states had. The Constitution made it very clear that the national government would only have the powers that were listed in the Constitution. We'll learn that these powers listed in the Constitution for the national government are known as enumerated or delegated powers. For instance, only the national government can declare war or make treaties or agreements with other countries. But it's the state's job to deal with things like marriage, driver's licenses, education, and elections. Again, we're going to learn more about this in an upcoming video, but you need to remember that federalism is the concept that the national government and the state governments need to work together, and that they have different powers that are made clear by the Constitution. So let's review. Which principle implies that the people are the ones with the power over the government? That's right, popular sovereignty. Next, which principle describes how each branch directly limits the power of the other branches?